So, in Brisbane, is there any general theme for the architecture?
Yes, I guess we've got a fairly climatically responsive architecture generally. So you find particularly our architecture is quite different to say Melbourne, which has a very, very different climate, a more European climate, and tends to, I guess, look to Europe often for models of architecture, whereas we might look to more models in Southeast Asia or some similar subtropical or tropical environments in terms of shading and reduction of glare and natural ventilation and sustainable design and things like that.
How's the architecture influenced by the various artisans from other countries who helped build these structures?
Sorry, how do you mean?
Is the architecture influenced by other artisans from other countries? So basically other cultures. So is it influenced by any other of those?
Yeah, I mean traditionally we've come from an Anglo-Saxon background, I guess generally from a built environment perspective. So architecture education tends to start with classical architecture, I guess, as a background to the history of Western architecture particularly. But then in Australia we're pretty lucky in that we've got a fairly substantial migrant population, and because of our proximity to Southeast Asia and our environment as well, there's been an awful lot of influences in contemporary architecture, I guess, particularly from Japan. You see a lot of Japanese architectural influences coming in, especially even in our work, but a lot of particularly Eastern Seaboard kind of architects, Sydney School architecture and Newcastle and Queensland tend to have a lot of Eastern influences in their built environment. So it's a good mix of both. There's a thing called critical regionalism in architecture, whereby you take a particular type of architecture, but you really make it your own according to your context and your environment, and then design to those constraints.
Would you say Brisbane's architecture is or will be classified as one of the well-known cities for architecture?
I'll probably tread on some toes here, but probably not generally, I would say. It's flown under the radar in Australian terms as being, I guess, Melbourne and Sydney are the big names in contemporary architecture, or have been. But I think Brisbane's coming into its own, particularly as having a fairly unique subtropical environment to work with. So there's a lot of Brisbane firms who are making a name for themselves worldwide now.
From an architect's point of view, if you were to design a building, how would you make it an iconic landmark to make it stand out?
There's a lot of argument about iconicism and whether you should actually make something iconic, because if everybody's trying to make shout at me iconic buildings, then there's no legibility in an urban streetscape sense. So it's I guess there's a time and a place for the iconic buildings, but it's something that after a while starts to make you cringe, kind of the concept of an iconic architecture, whereas you might push towards a more contextual or quiet architecture that serves its occupants' needs more than its need to yell about itself. But that said, if you were given a brief to create an iconic or a gateway building or something that was the core brand for an institution or a client, you would start to look at scale and level of materiality and detailing. But for us, particularly here, there's always the emphasis on how the people more so than what does it look like from a photograph. It's more important that people experience the building and have a great building to live in and occupy, rather than it needs to look great too. That's part of it, but that's certainly not the primary focus for us.
When you're looking for an iconic landmark, what do you generally look for?
I guess there's a tendency towards looking at the scenographic, so looking at what is great from a photographic or an artistic sense. So if you see a photograph of a building, often they'll look fantastic and iconic, and then you the enduring icons, say things like the Opera House in Sydney, which I had a tour of again recently. They're amazing buildings at all scales. So there's an element of making a nation or making a city or making a place that would be worse if that building wasn't there. And there's also the element of it being a fantastic contributor to the cityscape or the townscape or the landscape, and integrating all of those things into its form, but then having a level of detail and humanity to it as well, as you get closer and closer, so it retains that level of being an icon even when you're in it and using it, rather than just standing back and looking at it.
Majority of people who we interviewed said that they didn't think the structure of the buildings could withstand natural disasters. How would you fix this?
Well, I think there's a certain level of we operate with structural engineers and within building constraints that almost dictate a certain level of resistance to natural disaster, according to your climate and according to where you are in the world. I think that there's always things that nature will throw at you that are problematic, from an earthquake or a tidal wave or some scenario that hasn't been known in that particular area. But generally, we're fairly well regulated in terms of, if we're designing a building in the north where there's cyclones and other natural disasters, then our buildings have to change because of that. So in Australia, we're fairly well regulated. And beyond that, it's pretty hard for me to comment, I guess.
When you are designing a building, what are the most important features for the buildings?
Occupant comfort and functionality are the good starting points. There's got to be an element of aesthetics and beauty that people, that makes a building endearing to people, because the more people love a building, the longer it lasts, and the ultimate sustainability is a building that never needs to get demolished because people love it so much.
What do you think should be improved on modern buildings?
That's a pretty big question. I think part of the issue with a lot of modern buildings is clients particularly needing to understand how much a building costs to build and what the implications are for reducing the cost on certain things. And it's also the way buildings are built and procured. And procured means the way we actually design a building and then get a builder to come and build the building. And that leads to some poor quality outcomes in building.
75% of the people that we interviewed said that they preferred the older buildings over the traditional ones. Why do you think that is? Do you think the modern buildings have become too common?
Andrew, I think there's an element of familiarity with older buildings, and again the whole idea of scenography and being learnt, having a mind that learns to see a certain thing in a certain way, that lends looking at older buildings with that level of familiarity and love and trust, and there's a reminiscence and a nostalgia that people love about it. But I think there's genuinely an element of care and craft that's gone into a lot of those buildings that tends not to exist anymore. And they're often buildings that have been built over a long period of time, and the way our population grows and our built environment structure now, it's difficult to achieve that same outcome with the skills that we've got now and the time frame that we need to build things and the amount of money we have to spend on buildings as well.
I think you also find that, unfortunately, with modern buildings or contemporary buildings, that the quality of finishes are a lot lower, so the buildings tend to not last as long. If you see apartments from the 70s, they're still standing and they're reasonably preserved, whereas you look at contemporary buildings, you go in there, they've been lived in for about a year or 2 years, and the finishes start to chip off, the finishes, you can tell there's a bit of wear and tear, and so I think that's one of the reasons people tend to
Does Brisbane's architecture and structure make a world-class city in building structure and design?
Historically, I would say, historic in modern terms, I would say no, but definitely now, yes, its architecture is of a world class and it's on a world stage. So we kind of went through a period where some of our old buildings are certainly world class old buildings. The Treasury Casino, for example, those sorts of buildings. But then there was probably a lull, and now it's coming ahead again.
Do you think the council have designed the cities to have efficient use of special awareness?
What do you mean by special awareness?
Like when they were designing the city in the whole, do you think they had like some kind of like awareness for the city, like where things would be placed, or like how people would get around, or just something like in general like that?
Yeah, I think Brisbane's not too bad in those terms because it's a fairly young city, and a lot of the general layout has been planned, and it's a grid city, which makes things a little bit easier. Arguably, it makes it less picturesque, but it's pretty easy to get around. We don't have the same inherent congestion issues that a city like Sydney does. That's grown from from a convict settlement, being a bit more ad hoc, grown from very small streets that are designed for horse and cart and things like that. And similar with European cities, we don't have some of those problems because it's a newer environment.
It's a good thing about Australia being a new country. They tend to learn from older cities like New York and a lot of European cities, like especially New York and Barcelona. They've been developed on a grid, so it's it's easier to get around. And I think Melbourne, especially, has developed, has been designed around those sort of cities.
How would you compare other cities to Brisbane's architecture?
Oh, that's a really open-ended question. It depends where in the world it is. I think as a general rule, we probably have a climate responsive architecture that's arguably better than a lot of other countries or cities in our locality who take on a more European model of construction and high-rise and glass construction that potentially isn't so well suited to their climate. But yeah, I mean the cities and their buildings are as diverse as the people that inhabit them, really. So it's a really complicated question.
Okay. Do you think Brisbane has made a good use of space? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
The urban design question. I think any city can always do better, and I think Brisbane's been criticised for its lack of laneway culture, or something that somewhere like Melbourne really exploits to its fullest extent. So there's always advantages to improving the use of space that we've got. As a general rule, I think the general city layout is okay, but I think all the infill developments that will go on in the next couple of decades are the things that will make the city and really contribute to its public life.
What are the steps that include to making a well-designed building?
First, you need a really good client who has a fairly clear idea of at least the outcome that they want, if not how to get there, and an ability to work with the architect. And there should be a good synergy there between client and architect, where there's a bit of give and take from each one. Developing a really good brief for the building is very important right at the beginning, before you even start trying to design things, I think, and really understanding the client's needs. Then the next most important thing is the site where the building's going. If you've got the opportunity to select the site, that's great. Often the site's given to you because there's no other alternatives, but if you can aid in site selection, that can really end in a beneficial outcome. Considering the environment, the sun, the wind, all of those things that go into passive architecture or passive design for climate is important. And then you start really designing the building from that point. So you've got your site, you've got your orientation, you've got your really good brief, and you've got a really committed client, and then you can go from there. And it's about, I guess, an iterative process of designing and testing against the brief and the constraints and making sure that something comes out the end of it that's beautiful.
So when the floods happened, why didn't you think the city council didn't replace all of the jetties after the floods, even though they were critically ruined?
I think there's a time factor that it takes. That there was obviously a failure with a lot of the jetties and the pontoons. That you just don't want to go and replace the same thing with the same thing, because the same thing's going to happen again in another 10 or 20 or 50 years' time. So I think they went about it the right way. They saw an opportunity to not only design pontoons and jetties and wharves that were better in their functionality and more resilient to natural disasters, but then they also saw the opportunity to create something which could identify Brisbane particularly. So that's why they had a competition to design those. I think it was a reasonable process. It may have been a bit slower than ideal from a commuter's point of view, but I think the outcome is pretty good, and they're pretty world class. I think the way they operate in a flood, and also from a design point of view.
Well,
That's
that's
it.
all